They measure humanity by peace because that was all the galaxy had ever seen from Earth. And when the first human ambassador stood before the unified stellar assembly, calm and controlled, speaking of cooperation and shared routes and trade protections, the delegates recorded the species as low risk, socially flexible, technologically adaptive, but strategically passive. A civilization that preferred treaties to threats and compromise to conquest. And that judgment hardened over years as human. Ships escorted convoys without firing. Human colonies withdrew rather than escalate border disputes. And human fleets consistently yielded contested orbits when older powers asserted dominance. And so when pressure built in the outer spiral where resource lanes crossed human space, the Varelian Compact decided Earth would bend as it always had, because the Compact respected strength and saw none in restraint. And its admirals argued that peace was not a moral choice, but lack of capacity. A sign that humans had never faced a real war. And when the first Compact patrols crossed into the Helios corridor, Human Command did not respond with missiles or ultimatums, but with requests for clarification, recorded calmly by Captain Aaron Cole aboard the patrol cruiser Horizon Line, a man in his early 40s who had served his entire career without ever firing on a living target. And he followed protocol precisely, logging violations, transmitting warnings, and ordering his crew to hold position. And when the Compact ships ignored him and seized a civilian mining platform under human protection, the response from Earth was not immediate violence, but emergency sessions, layered diplomacy, and withdrawal of non-combatants, actions that further convinced the galaxy that humanity would not fight. And within the assembly, voices mocked Earth's caution, saying the species had grown wealthy under protection of others, and now faced the cost of its softness. And yet beneath that, calm surface, decisions were being made far from the chambers and broadcasts, in secured rooms where old doctrines were reviewed and contingency flags turned from dormant to active, and General Laura Whitman, a woman nearing 60 who had studied wars older than spaceflight itself, listened to reports without visible reaction, and then asked a single question about civilian losses. And when told that 12 workers had been detained and 2 killed during resistance, she closed the file and authorized Phase 1 readiness, a term few outside the command structure even knew existed. And as diplomats continued to argue for arbitration, shipyards shifted output silently. Training simulations were unlocked that had not been run in decades, and command channels that had never been used outside theory began to carry traffic, while Captain Cole was ordered not to retreat, but to observe, to learn how the Compact moved when it believed no one would stop it, and he watched as their ships grew bolder, intercepting traffic, enforcing tolls, and eventually issuing a formal declaration that the Helios corridor now fell under Compact administration, a statement delivered publicly to humiliate Earth, and humanity responded with a statement of protest that sounded familiar and safe, and laughter rippled across foreign networks, because peace had become a pattern, and patterns were exploitable, and what none of them saw was that peace for humans had never meant the absence of preparation. It meant the postponement of use, because humanity's history was not defined by how long it avoided war, but by how it ended wars when avoidance failed. And as the assembly adjourned with confidence that Earth would accept new boundaries, human fleets began to disperse, not massing in threat, but spreading thin, slipping into positions that looked like retreat and sounded like compliance, while data streamed home from every encounter, every maneuver, every overconfident broadcast. And deep within Earth's command archives, doctrines written in simple language about survival, escalation, and finality were being read aloud again. And for the first time, the galaxy's assumption that peace equaled weakness was about to be tested, not by anger or pride, but by a decision humanity had hoped never to make, that when peace is mistaken for surrender, war becomes instruction, and the lesson would not be gentle. The decision moved through human command with quiet speed that would have terrified the galaxy had it understood what silence meant to humanity, because there were no speeches, no dramatic alerts, only changes in schedules, redirected supply chains, and orders written in language so plain it seemed harmless. And Captain Aaron Cole felt the shift first when his rules of engagement were replaced by a single page that stated observation was complete and discretion now lay with local command. A phrase he had only seen in archive material from wars humanity rarely discussed. And as the Horizon Line maintained position near the sea's mining platform, Compact patrols began to behave less like administrators and more like occupiers, broadcasting restrictions, separating human crews, and making examples of those who resisted too openly, and every action was recorded, cataloged, and transmitted not as a plea, but as data, because General Laura Whitman had made it clear that if war came, it would not be driven by outrage, but by comprehension, and comprehension required patience. And while the galaxy saw delay, humanity saw mapping, learning the rhythms of compact command, the delay between orders and execution, the reliance on centralized authority, and the ceremonial rigidity that governed their fleet movements. And analysts noticed that compact captains followed doctrine even when it placed them at risk, because their society valued hierarchy over initiative, a flaw humans had learned to exploit long before reaching the stars. And on Earth, industrial zones that produced civilian transports quietly converted to military output under old emergency charters, while reserve personnel were recalled under the guise of training rotations, and scientists who had spent years refining theoretical systems were told to prepare prototypes for deployment, not demonstration, and across human space. Civilian traffic rerouted smoothly, not as a panic, but as a habit, because humanity had practiced this kind of transition since it first learned how fragile stability could be, and when the compact governor of the Helios Corridor issued a public statement accusing Earth of unlawful resistance and warning of enforcement action, the human ambassador responded with carefully chosen words that acknowledged the concern and requested further dialogue, words that reassured neutral systems and further inflamed compact confidence. And it was that confidence that allowed humanity to move unnoticed, because no one expects a patient to strike first, and the first human strike was not a battle but a disappearance. A compact logistics hub at the edge of the corridor went silent, not destroyed, simply gone from all tracking, and the compact assumed malfunction until another hub vanished, then another, each one removed without debris or warning, and panic spread through mid-level command while high command dismissed reports as sensor errors, and Captain Cole received a message marked priority black instructing him to disengage openly, to allow compact forces to believe he was retreating. And as the ship pulled back, compact patrols pursued aggressively, eager to demonstrate dominance, unaware that pursuit placed them exactly where human planners wanted them, in a region of space saturated with dormant platforms that had been seeded over years under civilian permits, platforms that now awakened and began to alter local physics in ways compact shields were never designed to handle. And when the first pursuing cruiser lost propulsion and drifted helplessly, its captain demanded explanation, receiving none, because humanity did not announce lessons before teaching them. And across the corridor, similar engagements unfolded, not as grand fleet actions, but as precise, isolated failures that eroded compact cohesion. And still the galaxy did not understand, because it expected war to look like spectacle, not erosion. And when the compact finally declared a formal state of war, believing it was escalating, humanity acknowledged the declaration with a single-sentence broadcast that stated Earth recognized a change in status and would respond accordingly. And within hours, the human fleet revealed itself not as a single armada, but as a distributed network, ships emerging from vectors no one had monitored because they had been categorized as non-threatening for decades. And the first true battle occurred when a compact task force attempted to regroup near a strategic relay, only to find a relay controlled by humans who had arrived days earlier under commercial registry. And engagement was brief, brutal, and one-sided, because human weapons doctrine focused not on exchange but on termination, disabling command ships first, then eliminating escorts systematically. And when compact survivors transmitted surrender codes, human commanders accepted them without ceremony, because the objective was not humiliation but function. And as news spread, the tone within the assembly shifted from mockery to confusion, and confusion to fear, because peace had been the only metric used to judge humanity, and war revealed a different scale entirely. The realization spread unevenly across the galaxy because human war did not announce itself with a single decisive clash, but unfolded as a widening absence of control, and compact admirals found that orders no longer produced expected results. Fleets arrived late or not at all, and communication relays answered with echoes that sounded correct but carried no authority. And within days, the compact command structure fractured into isolated groups, each acting on outdated assumptions, while humanity continued to speak the language of restraint in public forums, acknowledging concerns, expressing regret for loss of life, and urging stability. and that contrast between words and actions confused observers who could not reconcile the calm tone with the accelerating collapse of major power's military reach. And Captain Aaron Cole, now commanding a small task group operating under discretionary authority, saw the human approach in practice as his ships bypassed enemy formations to strike supply, coordination, and morale rather than chasing symbolic victories. And when his sensors detected a compact carrier attempting to withdraw with civilian contractors aboard as shields, Cole delayed fire until boarding teams could extract the non-combatants, not because humanity feared judgment, but because discipline was part of how it fought, and that discipline extended upward to General Laura Whitman, who rejected calls for a decisive annihilation strike in favor of sustained pressure that would force compact leadership to confront reality rather than martyr itself in defiance. And as human forces advanced deeper into the corridor, they encountered resistance that grew sharper and more desperate, because some compact captains adapted quickly, abandoning rigid formations and attempting ambush tactics learned from human history archives. But adaptation required autonomy their system did not allow, and those who deviated too far were cut off by their own command for insubordination, a failure that human analysts had predicted and now exploited. And in one notable engagement near the Los Reach, a compact flotilla attempted a coordinated charge only to find its own support ships lagging behind due to conflicting orders, and the resulting chaos allowed a smaller human force to dismantle the formation piece by piece, an outcome that sent shockwaves through neutral observers who had believed numbers alone defined power. And as reports accumulated, delegates began to review older human conflicts, discovering patterns they had dismissed as primitive, wars where resource scarcity, ideological divides, and sheer survival had forged doctrine centered on endurance and escalation control, and the phrase measure humanity by peace began to circulate not as an insult, but as a warning, because peace had been humanity's default state, not its limit. And within the compact, civilian unrest grew as trade collapsed and security promises failed. And leaders who had once boasted of swift enforcement now spoke of misunderstandings and proposed ceasefires that lacked credibility. And when a compact envoy finally requested direct talks with Earth under neutral observation, the human response was immediate but conditional, stating that discussions could begin once unlawful occupations ended and detained civilians were returned, terms that revealed humanity's confidence without bravado. And while negotiations stalled, human operations continued, methodically reclaiming platforms, restoring traffic, and establishing security zones that were quietly welcomed by local populations tired of arbitrary control. And the galaxy watched as a power that considered stable unraveled under pressure that was relentless but measured. And in private briefings, analysts noted that humanity had not yet committed its primary fleets, suggesting that what the galaxy had witnessed so far was not the full weight of human war, but a controlled demonstration. And that understanding, dawning slowly and unevenly, carried with it a deeper fear. Because if this was restraint, then provocation had unlocked capacity that peace had merely concealed. And the lesson was spreading that humanity did not fight to be seen as dominant. It fought to ensure that once a line was crossed, it would never need to be defended again. By the time the Assembly convened an emergency session to reassess the situation, the language used to describe humanity had shifted from dismissive to clinical, because delegates no longer argued about intent but about capability, and that distinction mattered deeply to a galaxy that had long believed intent was the primary driver of conflict. And recordings from reclaimed zones showed human officers restoring order with a precision that unsettled observers, because there were no victory parades, no declarations of supremacy, only standardized procedures, local coordination, and clear timelines to withdraw once objectives were met. And this behavior contrasted sharply with compact practices, revealing that human war was structured around outcomes rather than emotions. And Captain Aaron Cole felt that structure when he received updated mission parameters that emphasized stabilization over pursuit, even as enemy units continued to fracture and flee. And during one operation, near a former compact administrative station, Cole encountered a senior compact commander who demanded honorable combat under traditional rules, a challenge rooted in ritual rather than necessity, and Cole declined without mockery, stating simply that the conflict was no longer about honor but correction, a phrase that later circulated widely across networks as analysts attempted to decode its meaning. And on Earth, General Laura Whitman addressed a closed council of Allied observers. explaining in plain terms that humanity's approach to war treated it as a failure state to be resolved efficiently, not a proving ground for ideology, and that philosophy shocked cultures that viewed war as an extension of identity. And as the corridor stabilized under human oversight, supply lines reopened, and civilian traffic resumed under new security frameworks that were transparent and predictable, earning quiet support from neutral systems that had previously tolerated compact dominance. Out of fear, and this shift in allegiance marked a turning point, because the compact no longer faced only human opposition, but the erosion of its assumed legitimacy, and attempts to rally support through propaganda failed as evidence of mismanagement and brutality surfaced, much of it preserved by humans who documented everything. And when compact leadership finally authorized a concentrated counteroffensive, deploying one of its core fleets in a bid to reclaim symbolic control, humanity responded not with equal spectacle but with layered defense that absorbed, redirected, and then dismantled the attack, forcing the fleet to retreat with heavy losses. And that engagement, observed by multiple neutral fleets, erased any remaining doubt about human military maturity, because it demonstrated not just strength but restraint under pressure. And afterward, human commanders issued open channels, offering evacuation corridors for non-combatants, an offer that further undermined compact authority when its own leaders hesitated to accept, fearing loss of face. And as weeks passed, the phrase human war took on a specific meaning in galactic discourse, referring not to chaos or destruction, but to an organized dismantling of systems that violated agreed norms. And the galaxy began to understand that peace had been humanity's chosen posture, not its defining trait, and that once war was engaged, it was conducted with a clarity of purpose that left little room for misunderstanding. And in private, some delegates admitted that the true mistake had not been provoking Earth, but assuming that restraint indicated limitation, because what humanity had revealed was not a sudden transformation, but a long-maintained capacity, waiting patiently behind a preference for peace. And now that capacity was reshaping the balance of power in ways no one had anticipated. As the conflict entered its next phase, the galaxy stopped asking whether humanity would win and began asking how far it intended to go, because the signs were unmistakable that Earth was still operating below its maximum capacity, and intelligence estimates revised human production figures upward as previously hidden facilities were identified, not through leaks but through patterns of sustained output that suggested deep reserves. And Captain Aaron Cole was reassigned again, this time to A, coordination role overseeing joint operations with neutral system defense forces that had quietly requested human guidance, a development that would have been unthinkable months earlier. And Cole noted that these forces were not being absorbed or commanded but advised, given frameworks rather than orders, because humanity understood that lasting stability required local ownership. And this approach contrasted sharply with compact doctrine, which relied on centralized enforcement and now struggled to maintain even internal coherence. And reports from within compact territory described command disputes, delayed responses, and rise and descent as civilian populations questioned leadership that had promised easy victory over a peaceful species. And General Laura Whitman monitored these developments with caution, reminding her staff that collapse could be as dangerous as resistance, because uncontrolled fragmentation often bred atrocities. And so human operations shifted again, focusing not just on neutralizing military threats, but on containing instability, securing critical infrastructure, and preventing power vacuums. And this phase revealed another aspect of human war that unsettled observers, its willingness to plan beyond victory, to consider consequences weeks and years ahead rather than settling for immediate dominance. And when a compact regional governor attempted to defect with sensitive data in exchange for protection, human intelligence accepted the information but refused the spectacle, relocating the individual quietly and without public acknowledgement, because turning collapse into theater would only deepen resentment. And across the assembly, debates grew heated as delegates argued whether humanity's actions represented a new form of hegemony or corrective intervention. And the lack of a clear human narrative frustrated analysts who were accustomed to powers declaring intent loudly, but Earth's official statements remained minimal, repeating that objectives were limited to restoring lawful boundaries and ensuring security, statements that were increasingly difficult to dispute as conditions on the ground improved. And in one widely circulated incident, a human task force intervened to stop retaliatory violence by compact hardliners against their own civilians, an action that drew both praise and suspicion, because it suggested a moral line humanity was willing to enforce regardless of allegiance, and Captain Cole later reflected that this was the most dangerous part of the war, not the battles, but the expectations being placed on humans by others who now saw them as arbiters rather than participants. And as human fleets continue to operate with measured precision, avoiding unnecessary destruction while maintaining overwhelming advantage, the phrase "they measure humanity by peace until they witness human war" gained a second meaning, because witnessing was no longer passive observation, but lived experience. And the galaxy was learning that human war was not a storm that passed quickly, but a system that restructured reality around it, leaving behind fewer ruins but far deeper changes. And that understanding brought a new tension, because if humanity ever decided to apply that system without restraint, there was little doubt it could redraw the map of known space entirely. The pressure reached a point where the Compact's remaining leadership could no longer pretend control existed, because regions once bound by authority now operated independently under human-mediated security agreements, and supply chains that fed the Compact war machine were rerouted through transparent frameworks that excluded its central command, effectively starving it without a final siege. And this outcome unsettled the Assembly more than open conquest would have, because it demonstrated that humanity could dismantle an empire without declaring ownership of its territory, and Captain Aaron Cole participated in high-level briefings where Allied observers asked directly what Earth intended to do next, and the answer was always the same: restore balance and withdraw, a statement that sounded implausible to cultures that equated power with possession. And yet evidence supported it as human forces began reducing their visible presence, even while maintaining rapid response capability, signaling confidence rather than retreat. And General Laura Whitman authorized the release of selected historical records to the Assembly, not as propaganda but as context, documents outlining human conflicts where victory had been followed by reconstruction, restraint, and in some cases self-imposed limits. And this transparency was strategic because it reframed humanity not as an unpredictable force, but as one governed by precedent. And while skeptics remained, the Compact's inability to counter any human initiative weakened their arguments, and when a final Compact fleet attempted a symbolic stand near its home system, humanity did not rush to annihilate it, instead surrounding the formation and cutting off all external support, allowing time for internal descent to surface. And it did, as several captains refused orders that would have led to civilian casualties. And that refusal marked the effective end of Compact Unified Command. And when surrender was offered, it was accepted without conditions that demanded humiliation, only compliance and disarmament. And the galaxy watched as the war ended not with decisive explosion, but with a series of controlled conclusions. And in post-conflict assessments, analysts noted that humanity had suffered losses, yet never escalated emotionally, maintaining proportional responses that denied opponents the narrative of heroic resistance. And Captain Cole returned briefly to Earth, where he observed no celebrations, only routine operations and quiet remembrance of the dead. And he understood then that human war was not an aberration from peace, but an extension of responsibility, a mechanism activated when all other systems failed. And as Compact territories began rebuilding under new charters that emphasized autonomy and accountability, the Assembly faced a sobering question: whether humanity's restraint would hold if challenged again, because the lesson was now clear that peace had never been a measure of human limits. It had been a choice, and the galaxy had seen what happened when that choice was no longer respected, and that knowledge settled heavily over every border dispute and political calculation, because from that moment on, every power understood that provoking humanity meant not a brief conflict, but an irreversible transformation of the structures that enabled aggression in the first place. In the months that followed the formal end of hostilities, the galaxy entered a period of uneasy recalibration, because while the guns had fallen silent, the implications of what humanity had demonstrated continued to unfold across diplomatic, military, and cultural spheres. And Captain Aaron Cole found himself assigned to an Interstellar Review Commission tasked with documenting the conflict from multiple perspectives, not to assign blame, but to extract lessons. And as he listened to testimonies from former Compact officers, civilian administrators, and neutral observers, a common thread emerged that unsettled even seasoned analysts, which was that many had not believed humanity capable of sustained, disciplined violence precisely because humans had worked so hard to avoid it, and that misunderstanding had shaped every decision leading up to the war. And General Laura Whitman, nearing retirement, addressed the Assembly one final time in a closed session where she spoke. without rhetoric, explaining that humanity did not see war as a proving ground or a path to glory, but as a failure cascade that had to be halted before it spread. And she warned that future peace would depend not on assuming restraint, but on respecting boundaries before restraint was tested. And her words carried weight because they were supported by evidence rather than threat, and across former compact space. Reconstruction efforts progressed under frameworks that emphasized local governance, monitored demilitarization, and shared security responsibilities, many of them guided quietly by human advisors who refused permanent authority. And this refusal became a subject of intense debate, because it challenged long-held assumptions about power accumulation, and some younger civilizations began studying human history more seriously, discovering patterns of internal conflict, recovery, and self-limitation that painted a more complex picture than the peaceful traders they had once dismissed. And Captain Cole noted that these studies often focus on the idea that human war was cumulative, drawing on lessons preserved across centuries, meaning that every conflict made the next one shorter and more controlled rather than more brutal, a concept alien to cultures where war reset norms instead of refining them. And as time passed, trade resumed through the Helios corridor under new agreements that included explicit conflict resolution mechanisms modeled on human frameworks. And incidents that might once have escalated now ended in arbitration, not because humanity enforced compliance, but because no one wanted to test the alternative again. And yet beneath the surface stability, there remained a quiet anxiety, because the galaxy understood now that humanity's preference for peace did not imply a lack of will, and that if pushed, it would act with thoroughness that left little room for recovery by aggressors. And this awareness altered strategic calculations everywhere, reducing overt expansionism and increasing emphasis on internal development, an unintended but measurable outcome of the war. And in personal moments, Cole reflected on how close humanity had come to being drawn into a far more destructive path, and how easily restraint could have been abandoned once victory was assured. And he took some comfort in the fact that it had not been, because the true measure of human war, he realized, was not the damage inflicted, but the damage deliberately avoided. And as the galaxy adjusted to this new understanding, one truth settled firmly into collective memory, that humanity had been measured by peace because peace was all it wished to be known for. But once war was forced upon it, what had been witnessed could not be unseen, and that knowledge would shape interstellar relations for generations to come. Years later, historians would struggle to define exactly when the balance of the galaxy truly changed, because there was no single treaty, no final battle, no moment of spectacle that marked the transition, only a gradual shift in assumptions that settled into policy, culture, and instinct. And Captain Aaron Cole retired quietly, declining public roles and commentary, believing that the story of the war belonged to the record rather than to individuals. And as he returned to civilian life, he noticed subtle differences in how humanity was treated, not with fear or reverence, but with careful respect, because borders around human space were now drawn with precision and honored without protest, and negotiations involving Earth carried an unspoken understanding that patience should not be mistaken for hesitation. And General Laura Whitman passed away not long after her retirement, her legacy debated but rarely challenged, because the outcome spoke louder than ideology. And within the assembly, new procedural norms emerged that reflected lessons learned from the conflict, emphasizing early mediation, shared verification, and explicit consequences for coercive expansion, measures that many admitted would have seemed unnecessary before humanity's intervention. And former compact worlds integrated into new regional blocks that favored decentralization, their recovery uneven but steady. And while resentment lingered in some quarters, it was tempered by the knowledge that escalation had only ever worsened their position. And scholars across species analyzed the concept that had reshaped their understanding, that peace could be a strategic posture rather than a moral endpoint, and that a civilization capable of restraint could also be capable of decisive force without contradiction. And this realization influenced military doctrines everywhere, shifting focus from displays of dominance to resilience, adaptability, and the avoidance of irreversible miscalculation. And humanity continued to participate in galactic affairs much as it had before, trading, mediating, exploring, rarely invoking its role in the war, because it did not seek to be defined by conflict. Yet it also did not obscure the record, allowing access to archives, battle analyses, and decision logs that showed how carefully escalation had been managed, and that transparency became its own form of deterrence, because it revealed not just what humans had done, but how deliberately they had chosen each step, and in quiet moments of reflection shared among diplomats and officers alike, there was an acknowledgement that the galaxy had been fortunate, not because humanity was powerful, but because it had been reluctant, and that reluctance, once tested, had proven bounded by resolve rather than fear. And so the phrase that had begun as a critique became a warning passed down to new generations, that they measure humanity by peace until they witness human war, and that witnessing had taught them a truth that no empire, council, or fleet could afford to forget. That peace offered by humanity was not the absence of strength, but the presence of choice, and that once that choice was exhausted, the consequences were not chaos or conquest, but a restructuring of reality so complete that return to the old ways was no longer possible. And with that understanding woven into the fabric of interstellar relations, the galaxy moved forward more cautiously, carrying the quiet certainty that some lines, once crossed, would never be drawn again.